Hi guys, in this video we're gonna keep connecting our modules together, and the last thing that was left out is the ARM module. Now I left the ARM module at the very end simply because it's kind of an exception. I mean, it's really not, but some additional observation has to be made, and these observations are related to the clavicle. So let's go into the whiteboard and let's start talking about it. So we have our head, our spine, our FK leg, our IK leg, and now we have our IK arm and our let's define it. IK is this one. I don't know what I just said, but these are the colors. Okay, so when we connected the leg, you can see that the leg, the input space for the leg was the pelvis, all right? And then we defined the world space and the local space. So the local space in FK mode is a transform that was aligned like the bone, and the world space, it's a transform that it's aligned like the bone. The input space, which is the main driver of the local space, is the pelvis. And this gave us, you know, by switching between if I go world space, rotation, into local space, and then we had the input space, rotation plus translation into the local space, and both of them, let me just go to big, and then in here there was a switch. Okay, so this, because we defined at the very beginning when I talked about this stuff, as you can see, this is, I'm using the same technique all over the places, with the head, with the leg, and I'm going to use the same technique for the arm. So this is why when in the video, in the first video where I introduced the spaces, I call this common interface. Because by reusing a standardized way of dealing with spaces, everything then it's much easier to debug. Okay. The other thing I've said is that in IK mode, there is really no need to define the space, because the IK per se already define a space where the IK thing is locked. Now, this is my preference, and this preference comes from the fact that in many years, even when we implemented spaces in IK mode, so the arm rotates, even if in IK you have an option where the arm completely rotates with the rib cage, I never seen that option being used. So that's why I'm not using it now, because I think it's, you know, it's a bit of a waste of nodes. By no means I'm saying this is true all the time. There might be, you know, a specific animation request that requires you to add this option. So I'm not against it. I'm just, you know, not going to implement it because I don't think it's strictly necessary. And the way you would do it for the IK is exactly the same. You would generate the input world in local space, and you would parent those controls underneath that, and then you drive that the way you want it. And this is a branch, by the way. So, okay, why I'm taking my time to describe the arm. So the arm, if we look closer at the skeleton, the main difference between between the leg and the arm is that the leg per se, you can think about having the leg directly attached to the pelvis, because that's how it is. There is a socket here and the leg is directly attached to the pelvis. But if this is the leg, the knee and the hip, and this is the pelvis, when it comes to the arm, we have upper arm, lower arm, and then the hand. Let me draw a foot here, foot. So if you consider these modules, these modules share a lot of similarities, where you can have the hip being, you know, the upper arm, the knee being the lower arm, the bone representing the elbow, and the foot being, you know, the extremities that can be, you know, compared to the hand. But the main motion of this spine here is not directly linked to the upper arm like the pelvis is for the hip. There is another bone in between, that is the clavicle. So a lot of discussion is well, there is different way of thinking this. I mentioned this already. I'm just going a little bit more in detail. If we consider this the arm module like we did now, and we consider this the leg module, then where does the clavicle go? Should the clavicle be part of the spine module? In my answer is no. My preference is the clavicle should actually be implemented in the arm module, and this boils down to the fact, so implemented in the arm module, not in the spine module. And this boils down to the fact that the mechanics of the arm, the complexity on how an arm moves, is directly connected to how the clavicle moves. And on top of that, if we go back to, you know, when I was talking about the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton, anatomically, the clavicle, it's a bone that is associated with the appendicular skeleton, while the axial is basically the spine and the skull. Okay, so these are my reasoning behind it. So among the two school of thoughts which should we implement the clavicle, my answer is the clavicle should be implemented in the arm module, and the spine should be left with the rib cage. So what this means in our, I'm almost done, I promise. What this means that in our module of the arm, we now have to add the clavicle. And we could have done this from the very beginning, but I'd rather explain the process and why certain things are done in a certain way and the reasoning behind it. So what this means is that we have an extra object here that is the driver of whatever is going on in the bones below. So, and this is the difference between the leg. The leg is directly connected to its input space, which is the pelvis, while instead the clavicle becomes the input space of the arm module, and the clavicle then follows whatever does the spine. So let's have a look. So you see here that slowly, the more I connect things, the better the rig hierarchy looks. Meaning that now we have just a series of controls and the skeleton. The controls are parenting in a certain way. I've described, you know, the parenting logic that I'm using, and I'm gonna do the same for the arm. And then we have a clean skeleton. An observation here to be made. There is something that control rig has, which is the ability also to add virtual bones. And these virtual bones do represent as transforms. And you can put these bones wherever you want inside the hierarchy, because this hierarchy here is not referenced, is imported. It means you can change it. So my goal was to not break any hierarchy in here, and use spaces as transform rather than bones. I'm not saying, you know, using bones is wrong. I'm just saying that to me, bones or virtual bones, they look to me like they are a type of asset that is more used in at execution time, which is something that I'm not trying to do yet here. This is just a purely animation, forward animation, keyframe animation rig. So that's why I haven't used them, if you were thinking that. Anyway, so let's have a look on how the arm behaves now that it's connected. The arm by default is in FK, and the leg by default is in IK. When I rotate the arm now, you can see that the arm is getting oriented like the world space. It's the same behavior that we're getting with the head. See, the head is preserving its rotation. Translation is fine. Rotation is not. Rotation, I mean, it's fine, but it's following the world space, which is aligned to the world. So what happens if I change the settings for the arm? One of the two arms. Let's see the difference. One arm follows both in translation and rotation of the rib cage. The other one is following the rib cage in translation, but it preserved the orientation based on its world space. On top of that, we have the clavicle, and the clavicle, it's an object that follows the rib cage, but it's also parent of it drives the arm. If I switch the arm in IK, this is the behavior that you get, which is basically locking the wrist there, and everything moves accordingly. Now, the reason why the bones are detaching is simply because each bone is skinned to one bone, and now stretching is on. Let's see what happens if stretch is off. Is this the... Oh, I would have to recompile. If the stretching was off, I'll do that later. But if the stretching was off, there will be no separation. The arm will follow. So this is how it looks. This is how the rig looks basically at the very end of its process. Now everything is connected. How I have done the arm. First thing I've done is open the module arm. And I added the things that we're familiar with. We have local space, world space, and orient to local. And then if I open the leg module, let's have a look. Actually, I can see it from here. Module arm. Let's get close to the module leg. When I was adding the spaces, you have input space, local space, world space, and orient to local for the leg. And you can see that the input space, this is what I was talking about. The input space is the pelvis for the leg directly. If I look at the arm, starting from the bottom is orient to local. We have the same. World space is the same. Local space. And then I simply add a clavicle bone and clavicle control. And actually, the clavicle bone is my input space. Okay? So I just added these at the very end. Although, you know, once we go through the cleanup, I will rearrange and rearrange this stuff so it looks much better. But you can... It's the same identical. I want you to think these are the same identical concept. The input space of the leg is the pelvis. The input space of the arm is the clavicle. So this is the only true difference. But in the interface, the mechanism is identical. So let's have a look at the hierarchy. Well, let's have a look at the graph first. What I'm doing here is I am taking, the first thing I'm doing is taking the bone, aligning the local space and the world space as initial, and these spaces are basically the where is it? Arm local space, arm local space. Children of these spaces is these controls, the FK controls that we're already there. I simply parenting them underneath. And then in our group of world spaces, we also have L arm and right arm world spaces. So if I'm looking at this module only from the right side, I am snapping the world space and the local space to this bow, which is the upper arm bow. It's the same thing I'm doing for the leg. So basically now these two transforms that I have selected, this one and this one, are aligned here perfectly on top of one another. And then what I'm doing is I'm taking the clavicle bone, which will become our input space, the clavicle bone, and I'm aligning the control clavicle to it. So the clavicle gets oriented, and this is the setup event. Okay. So now we have the clavicle oriented like the bone and two spaces here. The world space is children of the group above, and the group above is children of our main global offset, which represent our world space. Then the clavicle is children of the rib cage, and the only thing that is left is how are we dealing with these spaces. Is literally the same graph. If I am in orient to local, it's true. It means that I will get an FK behavior. Let me switch. Where is it? Let me switch that back to FK. I get this behavior. If this branch is true, I get this behavior because my clavicle space, my clavicle bone is moving the space of the FK both in translation and rotation, by using the transform. If this branch is false, I get the one that we have on the right side, where the translation is taken by the bone, the clavicle bone, and maybe it helps if I show the bones, where the translation is taken by this bone, translation, but the rotation is taken by the object that we call world space, and the world space does not rotate. So that's why the rotation is preserved. This rotation is preserved and never changes, only the translation does. The world space gets only oriented if I change the world. You can see that when I change the world, the rig comes as a whole. Okay, so keep that in mind. I hope that makes sense. I left out on purpose a bug, and it's mostly to, and this is one of those things where I'm trying to explain my thought process, and by doing so, a little bit of exercise on how to debug things. Now, the bug, I haven't shown it yet. I know it's there. And the bug is this. I said the clavicle are currently children of the upper rib cage. And if you play with this stuff, everything looks fine. The problem is that the rib cage has, and this is the way, you know, you need to start thinking about how you structure your things, because this is one of those many things that can make the rig look broken, but really it's not. It's just a simple mistake. So I said that this control, you can see that this control is children of this control, and this control is children of this control, which means when I move that, the clavicle moves. The problem is that this spine can deform and bend by using the upper rib cage control to give us non-realistic behavior. So in reality, you can see that when I rotate that, the clavicle doesn't do much and is not following properly. And the reason is the clavicle parent should be the spine 11. The same way spine 11 was the input space of the neck. And the way you do that is, instead of parenting the clavicle underneath the rib cage, you simply say that the spine 11 input output transform drives the clavicle by creating a clavicle space and just linking it to it in the same way we always done. So this is something that, you know, when you, I'm gonna do that, by the way. I'm not leaving it like this, but I'm gonna do that in the cleanup. I just wanted to say that, you know, always think of what is the last object that is supposed to transform your control space, and you know, it's not always straightforward. It really depends from the rig. If this was a more realistic kind of setup where well, mostly is the realistic, but if these joints were only one joint, then all of this would have worked, because the ribcage would have moved rigidly. Okay, but because I added those extra bones, we need to take that into consideration. Okay, so overall, this is kind of the completed setup, and I'm basically 30 videos to get to a setup that it's extremely similar to what, you know, the default control rig maquette gives you. But through this journey, we implemented modules that can be adapted to any skeleton and any skeleton orientation and any skeleton naming. And not only that, we have implemented a series of functions and utilities that automate a lot of process. What I mean by that is that if tomorrow I get a skeleton with different naming, different orientation, and different geometry, just by changing the names in this initial graph, I will be done. So instead of working for like 2 days on it, I would work 10 minutes on it, and everything will be adapted and the naming will be consistent, which also means that you can transfer animation between these two controller rigs, even if you don't have the same skeleton, which is one of the major benefits I think you get once you start developing modules that are a little bit more smart. So we're not done yet with Skeletron. There is a couple of more things that I want to do. The first one is implement a common eye aim, and then cleaning up a little bit and touch base. And after that, I consider, you know, the first character, which is very, very basic, to be over, so we can move on into other stuff.